Hey everybody, it's your friend and comrade here. So this episode is just an upload of a Twitter space that happened earlier today. It was hosted by Cage UK with Samidoun Palestinian Prisoners Solidarity Network, organising to build solidarity with Palestinian prisoners movements and its struggles for freedom. He was also joined by Suzanne, who's the president of the National Lawyers Guild, and the space is also joined by Palestine Action. The whole episode is about political prisoners for Palestine. So if you are Palestine Action, this is a must listen, especially since there's a huge new campaign to support Palestine Action prisoners, get them out of prison, and we are going to do that work. So do listen, take note. Here is the Twitter space.
British complicity with Israeli apartheid. So a bit about Palestine Action before we go in and speak to our guests. Palestine Action is a direct action network. It's based in the UK. It works and aims to disrupt the complicity of the UK government and corporations in the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And the network focuses on targeting companies that are directly involved in supporting or profiting from the Israeli occupation. And their actions include occupying and shutting down offices, factories, and warehouses of these companies to raise awareness about their complicity in the violation of the Palestinians. And I believe 2 Elbit System sites have been closed down already. Elbit Systems provides 85% of the drones used by the Zionist occupation military, including those used to assassinate Palestinians in Jenin and the assaults on Gaza. Now, we hear daily and we see daily the devastation that Palestinians suffer, but I still want to break it down in the context of this conversation and the struggle of political prisoners, both in Palestine and now the actionists that are in prison here in the UK. In recent weeks and days, we've seen the Jenin invasion. Over 1,000 soldiers were deployed by the Israeli occupying force. Over 150 armed Caterpillar bulldozers, armed drones, vehicles and explosive bullets were used. 12 Palestinians were murdered, including 4 of them that were children. Israeli forces bulldozed 3.9 kilometers of roads in Jenin refugee camp, deliberately making it difficult for ambulances to reach injured people. Ambulances and the press were attacked, as well as hospitals. Up to 4,000 people were internally displaced, and Israeli airstrikes damaged homes and infrastructure. So by disrupting the operations of these companies, Palestine Action aims to pressure them to end their involvement in the occupation. So by default, Pal Action is taking the position, and rightfully, that it is not criminal to disrupt the actions of the state that are rendering it complicit in the crimes committed by an apartheid regime. So this network is materially involved in dismantling the violence that we witness on our screens, but the Palestinians live every single day. And as we speak, the network is continuing its efforts to dismantle British complicity, and simultaneously there are actionists on trial. And I believe, as I said, there are 6 actionists in prison and 100 more who face prison for disrupting the production of Israeli weapons on British soil. And there's been a statement that's been issued, and we will link that in the conversation in the comments below, so you can access that. The statement has been signed by organisers and activists, academics and influentials, including Mohammed Al-Kurd, Kosi Mandela, Roger Waters, Muazzin Beg, Low Key, and many more. The final note in the statement reads that the heroes who've taken courageous action to expose and dismantle Britain's role in the colonization of Palestine should be celebrated and rewarded, not imprisoned. And we therefore call for the release of all Palestine Action political prisoners, and for the charges to be dropped against all those facing sentences for simply doing what is necessary. It's great to have with me in participation here today in this conversation individuals that are all working together as a collective in support and solidarity with the actionists in prison. Huda, if I can come to you first, my first question to you, Huda, is twofold. What does the direct action at present look like, and how does that work hand in hand with the ongoing trials and support for the actionists imprisoned?
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting this space and for having and for supporting Palestine Action and our actionists in prison. So our direct action started in the end of July 2020, so nearly 3 years ago, and it was in reaction to a failure of the democratic process to bring justice for the Palestinian people and, crucially, to end British complicity with the colonisation of Palestine, complicity which had been going on for over a century. And so rather than appeal to the powers that be, appeal to the government and to the establishment who were part of the oppressive system which is oppressing the Palestinian people, we decided to take direct action against all of these weapons factories, Israeli weapons factories specifically across Britain. And as you mentioned, our main target is Elbit Systems, Israel's largest weapons firm, who at the time when we started Palestine Action had 10 sites across this country. That was 5 factories, 2 offices, and they were also present and still are in 3 different Royal Air Force sites. So several of us, and now it's up to the hundreds, a few hundred people have taken direct action, which has ranged from people blockading the gates, going inside of the offices and spray painting the inside, people climbing onto the roof of these factories and dismantling the premises from the roof. And sometimes people break inside these factories to destroy their weapons of war so that they can't operate anymore. And so this has been effective in numerous ways. It has disrupted the production of Israeli weapons. The Elbit suppliers have also been targeted. And as you said, it has cost Elbit Systems hundreds of millions of pounds since we've launched, and also their partners and suppliers. And as you mentioned, it's led to the closure of two Elbit Systems sites. That's one in Oldham and one in London. And also they've been kicked out of contracts worth hundreds of millions of pounds. But what we're seeing is that we are, with these direct actions, people are risking their liberty in order to stop the functioning of these sites, which are part of a criminal enterprise or profiting from weapons on the Palestinian people. And so often this is leading to trials, sometimes in the magistrate's court and sometimes in the Crown Court. But we see the trials as a continuation of our actions. It's a chance to put Elbit Systems in the spotlight. It's a chance to examine their crimes and to try and prove that Elbit Systems are the war criminals in this situation, and that our actions are therefore justified and necessary. And so we've had several different court cases with different outcomes. We did win our first Crown Court case, but we're seeing now that in some cases, not in all trials, but in some trials, judges are removing the ability for activists to defend themselves and to justify their actions, which basically silences the activists and silences their ability to actually explain the true situation and to give a jury a full chance to examine the situation and to examine whether the arms company, the Israeli weapons company, is the guilty party or whether it's the activists stopping them from operating. And we've also seen, and this information hasn't come out yet, but it will shortly, that there has been Israeli lobbying behind the scenes with the Attorney General and other political parties who have been discussing our cases. So this is also something that we're seeing. But I think by imprisoning these activists in the first place, the British state is demonstrating their interests in protecting the military supply chain of a foreign apartheid state, basically, over the freedom of its own citizens. You know, the CPS in this country is supposed to deal with cases that are in the public interest. And that's the key thing, but it's not in the public interest. You know, we go to different communities who want these factories out, who are out there themselves outside these factories. These prosecutions are in the interest of the Israeli apartheid regime. And that's why they've been so keen in pursuing them. And just a couple of examples of this. We've had cases where the CPS actually dropped the charges and then Elbit Systems would review that decision, and then the CPS would go, okay, we'll recharge them. So they drop charges and then recharge them after Elbit intervenes, because they are deemed to be the victims in these scenarios.
And just on that, I know you had the siege in Leicester and this other ongoing actions, and it's given the challenges and from what you've described, the work and that you've put into this is still continuing. Is that correct?
Well, yes, definitely. For Palestine Action, we will continue until all of these sites are shut down, and these Israeli weapons manufacturers can't operate in this country. There was just an action this week where the sewage pipes of Elbit's factory in Leicester were concreted up, which has left Elbit's site in Leicester in serious chaos and severely disrupted, as we're seeing at this moment in time. But yes, the fight continues, and I think for those activists in prison as well, that's crucial, because we risk our liberty in order to be able to defeat Israel's arms trade in this country. And when we started Palestine Action, we weren't under any illusion that it wasn't going to be difficult and we weren't going to face serious obstacles. But every time you overcome these obstacles, that brings you closer to the end goal.
Yeah, and I think it's really, really commendable. You know, just you sharing what you have. In fact, that the fight will continue until every single factory is shut down. In terms of the prisoners, obviously, it does mean that now you're battling on different fronts. So there's the direct action, but there's also providing the support around those that are in prison and those that are on trial. And I mentioned earlier that there was a statement that has been signed by several academics, organisers and individuals. Do you want to just speak a bit about that, Huda?
Yeah, I think that was an incredible show of support to see from various different types of public figures, ranging from, you know, prominent Palestinians to lawyers to celebrities. And it just further demonstrates that that when people understand the scenario, when you understand what Elbit Systems and these companies are doing, and the fact that they are literally dealing in death and destruction, and they're making a killing of the occupation, you know, by marketing these weapons as battle tested, that they're continuing to do so. And then when you see activists trying to disrupt that is the appropriate and correct approach to take in such a situation. And, you know, there's no denying that in this country, the democratic process when it comes to Palestine is completely broken. You know, when we see in 2021, during the bombing of Gaza, over 500,000 people sign a petition calling for sanctions. You know, they have a debate in Parliament, and it's just painful to watch, because absolutely nothing comes from it. You know, we're seeing what bills they're trying to push through now, and everyone abstaining from it. I mean, we are, and I think, you know, before Palestine Action, what happened in Labour and everything else, all of these things demonstrate that if we realize the urgency of the situation in Palestine, the fact that it is continuing, and that we can't rely on the traditional processes anymore, then the route left for us is to take direct action. And that is the correct and the right thing to do. and arguably the legal thing to do as well, when everything else goes out of the window for these politicians and the establishment when it comes to them continuing the oppression of the Palestinian people. And for us, I think not taking action while you could be living 30 minutes away from a weapons factory which is building these weapons, which for someone who's alive today, that could be the weapon that kills them. And I think if you think of it like that, then it's easy to make that choice, even if it comes with risks. That is the correct choice to make. They never build these weapons factories, and they're not going to build them in front of Palestinians. They're building them in the imperial core because this is where they believe they are safe. And that's why it's so crucial that we engage in this battle from where we are, and that we participate in the Palestinian struggle for liberation from where we are, and take the most concrete steps to help them in that fight.
Thank you, Huda. I think just a couple of points I want to add, that through the network and the work that Pal Action have done, one thing that's now out there is that these are the factories and this is where they are and this is how they operate and what they're doing. That's become very visible. It's not shrouded in secrecy anymore. And I actually went down to Leicester and outside the siege outside the factory, and it was incredible to see the show of solidarity that was there. And it was very evident that the people in that community do not want this in their doorstep. They don't want it. So I think, to kind of correlate those 2 points, the fact that you've done the work and it's now out there, and Elbit and companies alike cannot hide what they're doing. And also the fact that the people in the communities, they don't want that on their doorstep. And so we all have our part to play in pushing back against it. I will come back to you, Huda, but I'm going to bring in Charlotte now. Charlotte is the international coordinator at Samidoun, and there's been a fantastic statement that's been put together where Palestinian prisoners movement has raised its voice from inside Israeli occupation prisons to show solidarity with the imprisoned actionists and demand their freedom. So I was reading the statement earlier, and the statement again highlights the root cause of the issue, which is complicity and the enabling of violence, and the prisoners commend the actions of the Pal Action network. Now, given that we now have actionists in prison here in the UK in solidarity with Palestine, how do we sort of continue to build solidarity globally and also simultaneously, because you're obviously working with prisoners on the other side?
Thank you so much for this important question and for highlighting the struggle of the Palestine Action prisoners and the struggle against repression in Britain as very much part and parcel and on the same continuum of repression and targeting that the Palestinian prisoners movement and the Palestinian resistance is facing inside occupied Palestine. As the Palestinian liberation movement has noted historically, most notably Ghassan Kanafani, that the Palestinian cause does not only face, the enemy that is the Israeli occupation. The Palestinian cause is confronting Zionism and is confronting reactionary regimes and is confronting imperialism, which is the primary enemy that is providing the funds, the military, the weaponry, the unlimited military, diplomatic, and political support. And we've certainly seen that in Britain from the era of the colonization of Palestine and the issuance of the Balfour Declaration to the present day, as the prisoners themselves note in their statement. And so the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian liberation struggle, is facing these enemies on an international level, on an Arab level, and on a Palestinian level. And what that also means is that when the struggle escalates outside Palestine and on the international level, the way that Palestine Action have been doing to raise up the level of international resistance and confrontation of the Zionist project and of the Zionist war machine, then we are also going to see a concomitant level of repression. And so in Britain, they might not be able to take you and throw you in administrative detention without charge or trial. But what they can do is arrest you, hold you on remand, and bring you before Crown Court and attempt to deny you the right to defend yourself in a meaningful way by, say, for example, as Huda was speaking about, cutting off the necessity defense. There are currently political prisoners of the Palestinian cause outside occupied Palestine. For example, in France, George Ibrahim Abdallah, the Lebanese Arab struggler for Palestine, has been jailed in France for over 38 years, and there's a growing campaign for George's freedom, even though he's actually won his parole in France. Of the French, Israeli, and U.S. governments have refused to process his release to Lebanon, in his home country. In the United States, there are currently Ghassan al-Ashi and Shukri Abu Bakr and Mufid Abdul Qadir, who are the prisoners of the Holy Land Foundation 5, who are serving sentences of up to 65 years in U.S. maximum security prisons for doing nothing more than collecting charitable funds and support for Palestine, because they were charged under a ludicrous interpretation of material support laws in the United States that essentially meant to target the idea that Palestinians could receive financial support from their own communities and supporters in the United States, in exile and diaspora around the world, remembering that Palestinians are, in a majority in exile and diaspora, that this had to be cut off in order for Palestinians inside occupied Palestine to only receive conditional aid that comes from the European Union, the United States, and Arab reactionary regimes that can be cut off at any mention of resistance. And so in order to cut off that flow of charitable support to the Palestinian people that was not conditional and that was not based on subverting and undermining resistance, there are now 3 Palestinian elders serving up to 65 years in U.S. prison. And so this is the context in which the Palestine actionists are being attacked. And so when we look, just like we look at George Abdallah and Mufid Abdul Qadir and Ghassan al-Ashi and Shukri Abu Bakr, that we are talking about international prisoners of the Palestinian cause. This doesn't mean that the conditions are exactly the same. Of course, right now in occupied Palestine, there are 1,083 Palestinians jailed without charge or trial in administrative detention under a so-called secret file, where neither those detained nor even their lawyers have any access to any allegations or evidence against them, out of 5,000 total Palestinian prisoners in occupation jails. Palestinian prisoners are men and women, children and elders, they're teachers and students and farmers and workers. They're overwhelmingly from the popular classes of Palestine. They come from Jerusalem, from occupied Palestine 48, from the Gaza Strip, from the West Bank. And in multiple occasions, there have also been Palestinian refugees in exile who have also been held in Zionist prisons. There have been Arab prisoners held in Zionist prisons. And historically, there have also been international prisoners held in Zionist prisons who joined the Palestinian cause and who joined the Palestinian revolutionary struggle. The kind of direct action that Palestine Action is taking up places Palestine Action as part of this international popular cradle of the Palestinian resistance. There are Palestinians on the ground who are struggling on a daily basis, not just to defend their land and not just to defend their lives from occupation and colonization, but to struggle for a future of liberation for Palestine from the river to the sea. And in order to sustain that resistance, just like we saw in Jenin last week, when despite the massive armaments unleashed by the occupation and by the Zionist colonizer, it was the resistance that was able to hold the center of Jenin camp and repel their invasion. That what sustains and grows that resistance is that popular cradle, that popular support, that base among the people. And that doesn't need to be confined just to occupied Palestine alone. That's something that, especially if we know that Palestinians are confronting not just the Israeli occupation, but Zionism, but imperialism, and the imperialist states that are aiding and enabling and arming this project, that we can be part of an international popular cradle of popular support for the resistance. And one of the first priorities there is shutting down the war machine. And what Palestine Action is doing is shutting down the war machine. And this is the context in which they're facing political imprisonment. It's very much the same context in which student activists in occupied Palestine are seized from their campuses and thrown in administrative detention because they held a book fair or organized an exhibition on their campus that was in support of resistance and liberation. It is very much that same process that we see inside Palestine and outside Palestine. And while the conditions of confinement might be different, and while the circumstances of 75 years of Zionist colonialism and violence visited upon the Palestinian people is its own unique circumstance, there is a direct connection. And so the Palestinian prisoners inside occupied Palestine, by issuing this statement, they're saying that we recognize that we have a common struggle, that we're part of one movement. And every day, the Palestinian prisoners are not just victims of the occupation. Instead, they're resistance leaders. They're continuing to lead in the movement for the resistance to fight back against Zionist colonization and for the Palestinian revolution to achieve the liberation of Palestine. And the Palestine Action prisoners, just as much as they're behind bars, outside Palestine Action, just as Huda was talking about, is continuing to do yet more actions, fighting back, fighting against the war machine, and challenging this process. And, one of the objectives of these kinds of attacks on an international level is to redirect the movement so that all we do is legal support and we are pushed away from doing the actual resistance and actual popular organizing that's being targeted. And something that's very clear here is that Palestine Action is refusing to get caught up in that process and saying we're going to put Elbit on trial instead. So in many ways, Palestine Action is learning from and incorporating the historical tactics and current tactics and struggle of the Palestinian prisoners movement inside the Zionist jails, but it's also engaged in a constant mutual evolution of struggle alongside the Palestinian prisoners movement. And so this is, not something that's just limited to Britain. We're seeing in France, for example, the Collective Palestine Vaincre and other Palestine associations have been ordered dissolved by the Macron government. And they've won a preliminary step in their legal battle, but the legal battle is still continuing on a daily basis, but so is the organizing. In Germany, there's been a tremendous level of repression targeting the largest Palestinian and Arab community in Europe, including the banning of Nakba demonstrations, the banning of Palestinian Prisoners' Day, and even a demand by the Israeli ambassador to ban the pasting of posters on the wall in honor of Palestinian prisoners and martyrs. You mentioned Khader Adnan when you opened the session. 6 armed German police were sent onto the streets of Berlin to strip a mural of Khader Adnan from an empty wall in a street in the center of the busiest Palestinian and Arab business district in Berlin. So these countries, just like we talked about the imprisonment of George Abdullah, the imprisonment of the Holy Land Five, attempts to ban boycotting the Zionist occupation in the United States, Britain, and elsewhere, these are recognitions on the part of these imperialist powers what their role is in suppressing and targeting and undermining the Palestinian resistance. It's on the same continuum with the listing of Palestinian resistance organizations as so-called terrorist organizations, which is another attempt to dismantle this level of popular support for the Palestinian resistance. But what Palestine Action has done through its courageous actions that are clearly in support of the Palestinian people as a whole, fighting back against a war machine that's being armed and funded from Britain, is something that really needs to be a lesson to all of us in the imperial core in terms of the possibilities and the potentials of what can be done, that our horizons don't need to just be limited or closed to lobbying Congress or, having a silent vigil, that there is more action that can be taken, but also that there are costs that accompany that. And that it's incumbent upon all of us to organize, mobilize, and act to free the Palestinian political prisoners who are the leaders of the Palestinian resistance locked behind bars, to liberate every one of those 5,000 prisoners, and to create a popular base of support for the actions of the Palestinian resistance to liberate their leaders and fighters and organizers and comrades, but also to nationally challenge the Zionist colonizer and challenge the imperialist war machine in the heart of the imperial core, that they will not be left alone, that they and their brothers and sisters inside occupied Palestine behind bars are leading the struggle, are fighting back, and are organizing for all of our future. And so when we see the Palestinian prisoners movement speaking out about the Palestine Action prisoners, that is a call to all of us to act, to organize, and to make clear that we will not leave our brothers and sisters behind bars, from the US to Britain to France to occupied Palestine.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. I think that you've said so much in there that resonates, and I'm really grateful that you were able to draw on the interconnections internationally and speak about some of the other cases that have been there for many, many years, and that those battles and those challenges are still ongoing. I will come back to you, but I am going to bring in Suzanne now. So Suzanne, thank you for joining us today. Suzanne, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers also issued a statement in which the point was made that Huda mentioned earlier about defendants in this case being prohibited by the judge from arguing their primary defense, that their actions were taken in the necessity to save lives and prevent a greater crime, and were not allowed to enter evidence of Israeli war crimes in court. Whereas Elbit-made weapons have been involved in attacks on Palestinians in Gaza, assassinations in the West Bank, as well as in British use of those weapons in Afghanistan and also in Iraq. The statement also points out that divestment of shareholders from Elbit is key. So it focuses on all the enabling elements of the complicity. And we will also share the link to the statement in the thread below after this conversation so people can access it. I just wanted to ask you, Suzanne, so democratic lawyers will be partaking and mobilizing in supporting the in solidarity with PAL Action. Where do you see sort of other legal networks, and what does activating other legal networks look like in the foreseeable future to support those that are being criminalized?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for asking me to be part of this conversation. Yeah, I'm going to try to answer that question, and sort of beginning with talking a little bit about what the International Association of Democratic Lawyers is. And it is a global organization that is decades old, representing various progressive, radical, in some cases revolutionary legal organizations, as well as individual jurists and legal workers around the world. That was created to be kind of a voice of the sort of global non-aligned movement back in the post-World War II era, right? And it continues to sort of be a very strong organization up until this day, with representation, throughout the global South as well as the West, including in Palestine. And an organization like that is sort of like valuable in its ability to sort of use platforms, right? Not just to call for the rights of political prisoners and dissidents and the rights of those that are resisting, but also, to do something similar to what we see happening with Palestine Action is to sort of use those platforms to be able to expose, confront, and use legal tools to try to shut down the sort of the entities or that reinforce these systems of oppression. And so, you could, I think that would be great if you shared our resolution with a larger audience. And I think folks could also, look on our website, IADL Law, which I think could give you a little bit more information about the organization itself. And we have a sort of a very kind of like comprehensive mission statement, but among what we put forth as being, our mission as this global progressive entity, is to, use our legal platforms and legal movements towards supporting, the principle of equality among peoples, the rights of peoples to self-determination, the elimination of imperialism and colonialism, among other things. And I want to talk a little bit about like what it means for organizations like IADL and NLG and other legal networks to support resistance leaders and support resistance movements. But first, I want to say that, like, in line with what the previous speakers were saying, Palestine Action has been a really powerful source of inspiration for many people, for many movements, right? And not just because of the brave ways in which they've been kind of like occupying and blockading, but like I think that it really does offer like an example of a model for particularly like younger organizers and activists that are trying to kind of like understand what does it mean to resist, right? What does it mean for us to resist, especially from within the belly of the beast or the belly of the beasts, right? Multiple. And, in the case of like what we've seen sort of like play out with Palestine Action, again, is like we see direct actions that have succeeded in exposing and confronting and shutting down Zionism, colonialism, and imperialism embodied in these very destructive and genocidal weapons manufacturers, as well as a larger war machine, as Charlotte pointed out, while also confronting and exposing the ways in which the UK is complicit in that. And I think it's also important to point out that, like, not only is this about kind of using those actions to confront, these global sort of the global larger war machine, but it's also about the way that Palestine Action has been organizing a people's movement demanding that their cities and towns end their complicity with these systems of an oppression. Stated differently, organizing a people's movement demanding that, or a people's movement that is focused on building not just sustainable cities, but anti-imperialist cities, anti-racist cities, anti-imperialist towns. And I think that, so not only has this movement become pivotal in how we see the global Palestinian liberation movement, as Charlotte has said, but I think it has also become pivotal to what it means for many movements, right, to understand what resistance is, and for many movements to think about what it means to elevate local organizing in the West to center confronting empire, right? And speaking from the perspective of somebody from the United States, that's something that is often missing. And so in that regard, and when as I was stating before, it's imperative that our radical legal community, which is a wide, multi-layered sort of like network, whether it be organizations like like the International Association of Democratic Lawyers or National Lawyers Guild in the US or Haldane Society in the UK, or it just, be maybe independent and sort of radical lawyers or legal workers or legal students. I think that it's important for us to sort of think about in our work what it means to support both the resistance leaders and the resistance movements, right? So how do we protect leaders from harm while also being able to offer our expertise, our platforms to support the necessary escalation of our resistance struggles, right? Because that's for many of us what we kind of understand movement lawyering to be, right? And essentially is about protecting sort of our rights and the rights of our nations, etc. And in doing that, it can't really just be reduced to this idea of rights as defined by a liberal legal framework that can often reinforce these systems of oppression. But I think that we need to kind of think about examples of legal defense movements akin to what we've seen develop for the freedom of other political prisoners, right, including many of the ones that Charlotte had mentioned, but also hearkening back to other revolutionary struggles. When we are thinking about what it means to build kind of a people's legal movement in support of political prisoners, Palestinian political prisoners in the United States, we look to see how do the Black Panthers could organize in support of their of their political prisoners. How did the indigenous movement confront also this kind of repression? How did other movements confront these kinds of repression? Also, but not just in our own country, but we also see many great examples from other parts of the world, right? And also to sort of understand that, in the way that Palestine Action has kind of used direct action as sort of a vehicle for that necessary confrontation, exposing and dismantling. I think that on one level, yes, the courts are there for folks to go in and say, you're violating the rights of these individuals and of these organizations, and we want redress, we want this. But the courts can also often be kind of an extension of the larger movement. They also can be the platforms that in which we confront and expose and seek to sort of shut down these systems of oppression. And I think it's very, very telling what you said, that the defendants in this case were prohibited by the judge from arguing their primary defense. And to hear why, their actions were so vital in, saving the lives of Palestinians and others, right? Because we know that these weapons don't just impact Palestinians, but they largely do. But Palestine Action themselves have informed us of the farther sort of reach of these manufacturers to save the lives of countless people and prevent further crimes against humanity, right? And I think it's very telling. First of all, from what I understand, that for a long time, a lot of these kind of days in courts, trials were delayed, right? And then we now have a situation where, the prosecution is going forward without the opportunity to be heard, because the courts can become not just the courts themselves, but kind of the legal tools, the legal platforms that we either are already a part of or that we build and demand for ourselves, really kind of become that place that we can also use for the exposing and the confronting and the dismantling. Really, as we say as lawyers, like where we put out our narrative of what is going on. And I think that that denial of that opportunity is something that we need to really focus on and confront.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I will definitely be sharing the statement. So you can find the statement after this conversation in the thread. In the thread, I will add the statement by the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. Please do check that out. I'll also share the statement that Samidun have put out, and the statement that has been signed by various different activists, organisers, influential. So please do have a look at those. We are unfortunately coming to the end of this discussion. It's been wonderful to hear from all three of you, Huda, Charlotte, Suzanne, and I think we can easily go on. But I do want to give you a final note, and if I can ask you to perhaps just share some insights in terms of what next, and what can people that are listening in today and that will listen into this conversation after this conversation, what can people do to support the PAL Action prisoners or to support PAL Action? Charlotte, if you can perhaps elaborate more broadly, even in an international context, and Suzanne. So Huda, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. I'd just like to start by saying that in Palestine Action, whether our defences are removed or kept in, that we insist on continuing the fight. And if that means pleading not guilty and appealing to a jury to find us not guilty, which they have the right to do without a defence, then that is what we will do. And we promise that if we're going to go down, or if some of us will go down, that we're definitely going down fighting throughout the whole process. And that we know that there is many people on the outside who will always continue the fight to shut down these factories, and that Palestine Action is not in any way going down. We're only getting stronger. And so that's why I think support for our prisoners is so crucial in strengthening this movement, as well as joining us on the front lines directly. But I just want to quickly read, Mike is one of the prisoners. He is actually a scientist who was imprisoned for occupying APPH, which is a Canadian weapons factory who supply parts for Israeli drones, as well as parts for Israeli and Saudi fighter jets. And he's currently in prison, and we hope that he will be released towards the end of next month. He's been inside since February. And when he was imprisoned, he said, "I have seen how the Palestinian people are best second-class citizens on their own ever-shrinking lands. Clearly, this is apartheid. We have denounced and defeated it before, and we must again." And I think he was referring to his own trip to Palestine several years before he did take direct action to shut down this weapons factory. And if you want to write to Mike, you can send an email, and which will be forwarded on to him in prison at mikeonremand@protonmail.com. So that's mikeonremand@protonmail.com. And to all of our other prisoners, you can write to palactprisoners@protonmail.com. I'll also try and add that to the thread at the end of this call. But we also have an International Day of Action coming up in support of the prisoners, and that will be next Saturday, so the 22nd of July. So wherever you are, we encourage you to organise in whichever capacity you can, whether that's banner drops, whether that's protests, or whether that's actions as well. Obviously, any company who is complicit with what Elbit Systems and other weapons manufacturers are doing are welcome targets for that. But also the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, do have offices in nearly every city in Britain. So they are also a place that you can protest against on that day of action. So we'd encourage you to join that as well. And you can also donate to our legal defense fund, which is on our website on PalestineAction.org. And also, if you want to join us and take action to shut down these weapons manufacturers, then you can also sign up to join us on PalestineAction.org. And I just want to thank again everyone who's been supporting us, and to the other speakers on this call. It's been very empowering to hear you all speak on this topic, and to remind ourselves of the global struggle for the liberation of Palestine, and of course leading with the Palestinians behind bars in Palestine as well.
Thank you, Huda. Charlotte, would you like to come in next?
Sure. Well, I want to second everything that Huda said and encourage people to organize actions and events in their areas on July 22nd and beyond. If you can, first of all, Elbit and Elbit associated locations remain points of confrontation and attention throughout all of this. So if you have an Elbit associated location in your area, standing in solidarity with the Palestine Action prisoners is a great time to take action against Elbit in your area as well. Beyond this, you can organize at British consulates. You can organize, there's British consulates in many cities in Western countries. Beyond this, in Canada, for example, Scotiabank, one of the largest 5 banks in Canada, is the largest single foreign investor in Elbit Systems. And so Scotiabank is directly involved in profiting from Palestinian death and profiting from attacks and assassinations on Palestinians from Gaza to Jenin. So if you're in Canada and you don't have a British consulate near you, think about protesting at a Scotiabank on July 22nd and beyond to shut Elbit down and to stop these attacks. So in every country, in every city, there's something that you can do, even if it's as simple as taking a photo online, even if it's taking this issue to an organization that you're a part of and adopting a resolution. There's something that you can do to help shut Elbit down and to help defend the Palestine Action prisoners. If you can take a direct action, that's also something that you can do. But if you can't do a direct action, there are many steps that you can take to build that popular movement, to build that popular support. I mean, that's one of the things that Suzanne talked about that has been so essential to Palestine Action's approach, is building that mass base of community support for shutting Elbit down and for saying that this is an unwanted industry that is destructive, that is destroying people's lives, that is destroying people's futures. And this is why it's so important and indeed necessary for us to take action. If you're a part of a legal organization, we urge you to speak up about these cases. And we also urge you to speak up about the repression targeting Palestine activism internationally. So in the United States, in Britain, in Germany, in Spain, in France, in the Netherlands, and elsewhere. And of course, to organize and mobilize for the liberation of Palestinian political prisoners. As we noted before, there are 5,000 Palestinian political prisoners currently held in Zionist jails. 1,083 of them are currently held in administrative detention. You can protest and organize for their liberation. When we talk about the Palestinian political prisoners, they are not just prisoners of the Zionist regime, they're also prisoners held by every single one of these imperialist powers that is funding and supporting and aiding and propping up that regime inside, that colonial regime inside occupied Palestine. And so we have the absolute ability and need to demand that these governments end their ongoing imprisonment and targeting of the Palestinian people and of the Palestinian prisoners. Our actions around the world, sometimes they are large and sometimes they are small, but they are all noticed by the Palestinian prisoners inside Zionist jails. They're all taken note of, and they are critical to breaking down isolation, One of the things the Zionist regime wants to do is to isolate the Palestinian prisoners movement. They want to isolate them not from their communities, from their organizations, from their collectives, from their societies, because of the potential that they have to organize Palestinians to fight back and defeat Zionism. But they also want to isolate them from their natural allies, supporters, and comrades in the broader Arab struggle, in the regional struggle, and in the international social justice movement. So every time that we organize to free Walid Daqqa, the Palestinian political prisoner, freedom fighter, and intellectual who's currently suffering from severe Israeli medical neglect, as well as rare bone marrow cancer, myelofibrosis, and has been repeatedly denied release. Every time we organize to free Walid Daqqa, every time we call to free Mohammed Abu Saha, the circus teacher who's being jailed without charge or trial, these efforts are noticed, they're significant, and they help to break down these walls of isolation that the occupation wants to impose. Similarly, you can also write to Palestinian political prisoners in Zionist jails, just like the case for the Palestine Action prisoners, in the case of Mike that Huda just spoke about. Writing these letters helps to boost morale, sustain support, and grow their and show that this isolation is working on the part of the Zionist regime. So we have information at samidoun.net about how to write to Palestinian political prisoners, how to organize a letter writing event, and how to, you can write letters to Palestine Action prisoners, to George Abdallah, and to Palestinian prisoners in occupied Palestine together, showing that this is one struggle, one movement, and we will not let any of our prisoners be left behind.
Thank you so much for that, Charlotte. And feel free to share any links in the thread after this conversation so people can just get in touch. I think, Huda, did you want to come in? You had your hand up.
Yes, just a quick one. I just also wanted to add that we have trials going on all of the time, and they are across the country. So if you are in England or even Scotland, then there are plenty of trials that you can go and support, and it is so crucial that people do that as well, because that is continuing the fight. And I think it's so important for the courts to see how much support we have on our side. And you can also watch as put Elbit in the dock and fight to prove that Elbit is the guilty party in these cases. So you can find out more about that at palestineaction.org/trials. We have a trial coming up next week on the 17th and 18th, which will be at Wolverhampton Magistrates Court, but there's several other ones as well that you can find on our website.
Thank you for that, Huda. Suzanne, do you want to come in with your concluding points?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'd mainly just endorse everything that's already been said. I think in particularly around sort of the importance of mobilizing our local movements to participate in this day of action, right? And the importance of sort of making sure that they don't succeed in kind of isolating this movement. And for the legal networks, I would add to what Charlotte already said, to pay attention to what's going on and offer your support for the different local actions that might be happening in your country, in your city, in case support is needed. And then also just what we wrote in our resolution, that we're committed to and taking the lead of the Palestine Action organizers and answering their specific calls for support, and also hear from them as to how else these networks could be useful.
Thank you, Suzanne. I just want to thank everybody that has joined today to listen into this conversation. You can also share this conversation after it's finished, so please do. Thank you to Huda, to Charlotte, and to Suzanne for taking the time to be present today. And we'll stay connected, and we'll keep our listeners up to date with everything you can keep up to date on through our Twitter feed. We usually do share our updates on there. I do want to end with a final quote, and it's a quote by the longest serving Palestinian prisoner. He was released from an Israeli prison. His name is Karim Yunus. He was released at 66. And he said, "We have fought and sacrificed for the right of self-determination, for our country and dignity, and we will continue to fight from the depth of ourselves with all that remains of our lives. Prison has not controlled us, and the captors that chain ourselves have themselves become prisoners in our lives. Therefore, we shall imprison the occupation with the might of our resistance and persistence for freedom. The occupation shall remain watchful, preoccupied, and anxious." Thank you, everybody, for joining, and I will end the conversation there.